welcome to New Song. Come sing a new song with us.
A reading from Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. Hear now the reading. And the man of the house of Levi went and took his wife, a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and put pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew woman, that she may nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew. And she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." Here ends the reading. Word of God, word of life.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Charlie. Morning, New Song. We're continuing our Splish, Splash sermon series. We've gone through the waters of creation. Last week we talked about the Ark of the Covenant and the 40-day flood, and today we move on to Moses floating down the river. And I want to start by asking a question. Where do you guys fall on the nature versus nurture debate? You know what the nature versus nurture debate is. How did we become who we are? How did Frank become who Frank is? How did Deborah become Deborah? Was it something you were born with, or was it the environment around you that shaped who you are? What do you think? Both. Good answer. They actually studied whether you get your sense of humor by genetics or by environment, and our instinct would be to think that it's environment. You know, if you kind of grew up with a comedic dad or mom, you might follow in suit. But they've actually come up with something called 5-HTTLPR, which is serotonin transporter linked polymorphic region of your brain, is where you get your sense of humor. So if you don't have a sense of humor, you gotta, I don't know what you do, you could just kind of expand that little area. I love the conversation, and I think our Moses story has a lot to do with this question as well, because Moses has such a fascinating life story that we'll get into in a little bit. And it reminded me, as we talked about Moses kind of floating down the river, it reminded me of when I got a chance to take care of my nephew Chaz. After my sister had her second child, I went to go work as a nanny for my sister Gretchen, and I was sort of the babysitter for Chaz and Grace. And Chaz was, I think, a little over 2 years at the time, and they live outside of London. They belong to a country club. And so I would go and take Chaz to the country club, and I would take him in the pool. And so I had this little 2-year-old kid in the pool, and you know me, I'm kind of like to push the envelope a little bit. So I had the little boy, and I was in my 20s. I had never had a kid before, and so this is my first time to really kind of explore these objects a little bit. And so I was in the pool, and I'd kind of like throw him away from me to see what he would do. And I threw him away from me, and he swam back to me like eagerly and energetically. So, well, that clicked something in me. Let's see how far we can push this kid. And so we're with all these very staid, English people. They're very, proper and staid. And so they were all kind of watching around. And by the end of the summer, I had the kid, Chaz, I would stand at one side of the pool inside the water, and Chaz would be at the other side of the water, and I would say, jump, and he would jump in the pool, and he would swim from one end of the pool all the way to the other, and come into my arms. And the looks of the people around the country, it looked like I was committing child abuse or something like that. But he had these big eyes, and he could do it. He made it. He swam all the way to me. Even at a younger age, little Moses, newborn Moses, was thrust into the Nile River by his mother. In a basket, of course, protected by that basket. Not at a country club pool, but down the Nile River, one of the great rivers of the world. What would cause a mom to do such a thing? To just put their child in this basket and send it down the river. We know the stories mainly because how many of you have seen either the Prince of Egypt or the one that maybe this crowd has seen, the Ten Commandments? Are you more the Prince of Egypt or the Ten Commandments people? Charlton Heston, Cecil B. DeMille, right? We know the story, and the Moses story is a very powerful story. It speaks to generations. It's an epic in scope. And we discover in Exodus that times are bad. Joseph, who had really been a hero to the people of the region of Egypt and beyond, right, had figured out a way to store food during the drought, and he had predicted the drought and took care of all sorts of people, including his brothers, and as they settled in Egypt. Years later, the Pharaoh and the people had totally forgotten the story of Joseph and how they had taken care of everybody. And by this time, the Hebrews had become a nuisance. They wanted to get rid of them. There were too many of them, according to the Pharaoh, and horribly, they were throwing little baby boys into the Nile River to cut down the number of Jews in the area. Awful. And wouldn't it be wonderful if that was the last story of genocide we heard in our human history? But we know from generation to generation, from land to land, in all regions of the world, horrible destruction and oppression happens from age to age all over the place. And so this mother, having birthed a child, is desperate to give it at least a chance to live. And so she weaves a basket made of bulrushes. I had to Google bulrushes. How many of you ever heard of the word bulrushes before? You knew it. Okay, good for you. From what I understand, the bulrushes are kind of the reeds that stick out near the river. They're strong enough to endure the river, right? And so these reeds were woven into a basket so that Moses could float down the river and enter into, of all places, where the Pharaoh's daughter picks this baby up. And this is where I think the nature versus nurture stuff comes in, right? Because Moses has a fascinating history, right? He's born to what? Slaves. He's born into slavery, but he's also born as the descendants of Levites. He is part of the priestly clan of Israel. But now he has found himself into the rich elite class of Egypt, right? Even though he's born a slave, he has found his way into the castle, the palace of the king, of the Pharaoh, and he grows in this area, and he lives kind of this dual lifestyle that seems to be unsustainable, right? He knows he has Hebrew blood, probably reminded of that all the time, and yet he has the benefits and the enjoyments of being really well off. And what's the thing that finally tips the scale? He goes out one day and he sees an Egyptian man just beat the pulp out of one of his Hebrew brethren. Just beat him down. Why? Because he could. He could. And that triggers something inside of him, doesn't it? And he unleashes all the complexities of this dual identity, all the rage that he built up over the years. And what does he do? He kills that Egyptian, thus putting his life in danger, and he flees and he leaves Egypt entirely, hopefully to never see it again. I'm done with Egypt. And he goes out into the wilderness, finds a family, lives his life. How often do we find ourselves limited by our own background? How many times have we sort of discovered that we put our own limitations on our life because of the background that we came from. Have you ever find yourself thinking that, well, I just can't be that, or I couldn't do that? You might have to go back to when you were a young kid, but did you have any limitations that you thought were placed on you because of where you came from? You came from a small town. Some of us come from families of abuse. If you know somebody that has been out of a family where there's abuse, does anybody know somebody or came from a place of abuse? That's a place of deep pain, isn't it? And oftentimes when we live in that family environment, we learn lessons. We learn lessons that stay with us. And we are taught messages, and we don't even need the people to tell us the message anymore, is because we learn to teach the messages ourselves. We have many Al-Anon members in our congregation as well, and Al-Anon family members of people with addiction struggle mightily to kind of find the true sense of self and value that is within us. And we often can't see beyond the limitations that we ourselves face and our own shortcomings. Moses kind of has this as well, because, God was not done with him, right? He's had a pretty amazing adventure right now. He's floating down the river. He's found his way into the castle. Now he's killed a man and he's out in the wilderness fleeing, but God isn't done with him, is he? What happens next? The burning bush, right? God calls Moses into duty, right? And he says, I need you to do something. I'd like you to do a small thing. I want you to lead your people out of Egypt into freedom. Not a big deal, right? Do you know how Moses responds? He says, yes, sir. No. I think Moses has 3 denials. He has 3 reasons why this is a bad idea. And I think they kind of progress to get to the very truth about why he thinks it's a bad idea. The first thing he says is, no, God, well, who will I tell them has sent me? I can't just show up to Egypt and say, I'm going to come and save you. Who am I going to tell sent me? And God, you know what God says to him? Doesn't reassure. He says something, well, just tell them I am that I am sent me. So imagine you show up to the slaves and you say, well, who sent you? I am that I am? Not a very clear and concise answer, right? Very confusing and unsettling. The second thing he says is, well, how will I know that I have any power? How will they believe me? And God says, you see that stick in your hand? Throw it on the ground. And what does it do? It turns into a snake. And then all of a sudden, Moses discovers that he has power. No more excuses, right? And now the third time he says, no way, God, we come to the truth. The reason he didn't want to go had nothing to do with God himself, but had everything to do with how he understood himself. You know what he says? You can't send me. I'm kind of slow and dumb of the mouth. I can't talk properly. I stutter. I'm not the one. You can't really want me to do this. I'm slow of speech. I'm not eloquent. I can't do this. And we discover the self-doubt that he had was so overwhelming that he really couldn't see himself do it. And God says this, who has made your mouth? Who makes people deaf or able to see or blind? Is it not I, Lord? Have I not made you just the way you are? I will be with you and with your mouth, and I will teach you what to say. Do not worry about it. And so Moses discerns all the limiting voices in his head, and I invite you to think through all the limiting voices that have played in your head from time to time. And he chooses instead to trust God and begin this amazing journey. Maybe there is nurture in there somewhere. You see this little baby boy facing sure and certain death, right? Like when Mama put him in the basket, that was just kind of on a wing and a prayer, wasn't it? I mean, he's still floating down the Nile River, which isn't a small river by any means. Just a little hope that this kid will survive. It turns out that when he was placed in that basket, probably a lot bigger than this one, the Hebrew word for that basket, I got to get this right, is tevat or teva. And that appears only one other place in the Bible. Do you know where it is? I'll give you a hint. What's that? Nope. It was in our last week's story. The only other place we hear this word is when we hear the story of Noah and the ark. So the very same word for the basket of Moses is the same word used for the ark of Noah. It is a basket of protection, of safety. And Moses flew down that river, and he discovered something right in there. He not only survived, but he thrived. He made it. And I think he learned a lesson there, that when times are difficult and things seem overwhelming, God will get you through, right? Now imagine when he's leading God's people out of slavery, and he said, come on, guys, and they finally come with him, and they're running with him, and they're cruising, and then they get to this great big body of water. Not only that, but they got some people chasing them behind. I just wonder if Moses remembered, somewhere in the back of his psyche, I've been down the water before. I survived. We can do this. God is with us. And he takes his staff and he raises up, and what happens? The waters part, and the people walk through, and they survive, and they get to the other side. We have been told a lot about post-traumatic stress syndrome, right? We know a lot about the limiting powers of trauma in our lives. But they're beginning to do studies on post-traumatic growth. That is to say, sometimes, not all the time, but many times when we go through extremely difficult circumstances that one would very easily label trauma, we can actually learn powerful, resilient skills as well. In the New Testament, we discover a new river, a new ark. Instead of the Nile, it will be the Jordan. And John will come there and baptize for the repentance and the forgiveness of sins, and people will flock to him, and he will tell them and point them to Jesus. And we will discover in the cross of Christ an ark of protection that gives us salvation and protection in this world. And so we can move into this world with confidence, knowing that God has built an ark of wood that we see in the cross that will give us great safety as we go out into the world with power and grace. My nephew Chaz, remember he floated, he's a pool, not a river baby, but a pool baby. I think that he discovered something in there too. Maybe it's a little self-pride, but he discovered resilience in that moment. About 10 years later, he would find himself skiing in the Swiss Alps, and he had a horrific crash and was in a coma. He was sort of medevaced to a hospital and kept him in a coma for quite a while. And then when he finally came to and awoken, he found a very difficult pathway. Couldn't walk, couldn't talk, couldn't feed himself. None of it. And he had to relearn how to do each and every basic skill that we take for granted. It might have looked like the Red Sea as far as he could tell. But maybe, just maybe, he learned that, you know what? If I just swim a little bit more, I can make it to the other side of the pool. And we know 3 years ago, he graduated from St. Olaf College with a full degree, and now he's gainfully employed and is no longer dependent on his parents. So we know that in our own lives, through the gift of baptism and rebirth, we have this protective shell, this protective ark of the cross of the love of Jesus, who himself endured a great trauma, who himself endured suffering, humiliation, and pain, only to rise again. After which, all he could tell people was, peace be with you. I love you. As you encounter in your way the way of the cross, the way of suffering, I pray that you will see on the other side of that suffering the resurrected life. That each of us are river babies like Moses through the waters of our baptism. Amen.